Well, that was certainly a hard act to follow. I have to say, Kanchan brought me to tears with her passion and the work that she's been doing. However, we're going to move to our next event, and this, I'm really pleased to say, is the inaugural Writers Panel for SID. We're trying to do a lot of new things at the conference this year, and in addition to our important theme throughout the conference of solving the wicked problems of development, it is also critical to be able to communicate about life in other countries, facing difficulties, solving problems, failing at times, and adapting. In our writers panel today, we will look at a particular genre of fiction, a particular genre of the written form of communication known as creative nonfiction. I'm really sorry to interfere with your lunch, but this is so exciting. We have as our moderator today someone who is named the Godfather of creative nonfiction, so called by Vanity Fair magazine, and that name has stuck. Lee Gutkind is the editor of the Creative Nonfiction magazine, an author, a professor, and is distinguished writer in residence at Arizona State Universities. For those of you who yearn to write, he has a how-to book on writing true stories. And I will tell you that I was lucky enough to take Lee for class last semester, frankly, because I heard he was so cool. If I could take a single class at ASU, I should take Lee Gutkind. I had no desire to be a writer. I really just wanted to meet Lee. And it was an honor to be in the class every day. And frankly, by the time I finished the class, he made me want to be a writer. And why? Because each of us has really different stories in this room. We think of as normal. I mean, I was like, oh, well, that was in Rwanda. And he goes, Anne, that's interesting. And so we all live in this world, but we really don't tell our story. I'd also have to say that Lee challenged me a lot. Uniquely, we also have two writers from our community, and they are both State Department and USAID officers, an interesting combination. Ambassador Rick Barton is now current lecturer and co-director for Scholars in the Nation Service Initiative at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. And Alex Dehgan is the founder and CEO of Conservation X Labs and affiliated with Boke, Duke, and ASU. Their longer foreign service history, I will leave to you to look at their apps. And our third writer brings really a lifetime of experience and passion to create a different type of creative nonfiction. I was listening, Lee. I know the memoir counts too. Dr. Azar is best known for her 2003 book, Reading Lolita in Tehran, which remained on the New York Times bestseller list for 117 weeks, has won several literary awards, including the 2004 Nonfiction Book of the Year Award from BookSense. She's also written other books and more coming out soon. I leave the panel to you, Lee, to tell the story.
So I think Anne is pretty cool as well. And she challenged me back and did a really terrific job in our 15 weeks together. I'm encouraging her, as I will periodically this afternoon, encourage you to think about more and more of this incredible new genre, this revolution in literature called creative nonfiction. I guess I have to say also that Anne told you why I'm here, but lots of people don't understand this revolution I'm talking about. Last night, I had dinner with a couple of old friends, and I told them what I was doing today, and they said to me, why would they want to listen to you? And I said back to them, of course, why would I want to listen to them? So this creative nonfiction stuff is this new revolution that's happening in literature. Lots of politicians these days, corporations, businesses, organizations, everybody needs some sort of a narrative, a story to go with whatever product or service that they're selling. And in literature, writers, fiction writers, and poets are moving to nonfiction because we are much more interested these days, because frankly these days there's nothing in fantasy that is more incredible than what is happening in truth. Creative nonfiction is a balance between style and substance. The whole idea behind literary nonfiction, narrative nonfiction, is to teach our readers something about what we think and what we do, but to get them to be interested and to listen to what it is we have to say by embedding the information and the ideas we want to communicate within true stories. And that's pretty much what creative nonfiction is all about. And reader studies show that people learn more, they remember ideas and facts longer, they are more easily persuaded when information and ideas are communicated to them within true stories. And so Ann said I also work for Arizona State University. I'm a writer in residence there in a science policy think tank. And if you want to talk about challenges, getting policy nerds to kind of look out into the world and connect to the general public is very challenging. But that's what's happening in this world today. The three writers we have here are writers who are attempting to really share their ideas through boots on the ground stories that not only connect to the choir, that not only connect to you guys, but to connect to the world. And that's kind of what we're trying to do in the communication industry generally. We do so many interesting things in the academy, in government, in politics, that the world really doesn't understand and know. And when we mix them together, when we take a chance and talk about our own lives and then communicate our ideas and information, it really makes an impact on the people we're trying to make an impact on. And that's kind of the idea behind narrative or creative nonfiction. But it's a big jump, and it's a challenge, and that's why I want to now go to you guys. You all are more or less, please excuse me, but you're kind of academic, nerdish in many ways types. And I mean, look, he's a nerd. But why would you want to write a book, Alex? And why would you want to tell your own story along with it? What gave you that idea to do that, to mix boots on the ground experience with the impact you wanted to make and the information you wanted to communicate?
First, I just want to say it's an honor to be on this panel with my distinguished guests and the distinguished moderator. I also wanted to just say I have so many friends here I haven't seen from so long, from USAID and International Development, and it is so exciting to see everyone again. The question I think is so the book I wrote is called The Snow Leopard Project, and it was about setting up the first national park in Afghanistan. And people literally will say, why are we setting up national parks in Afghanistan? So being able to actually tie that story and that narrative, which I thought was inherently interesting, and being able to sort of bring in other levels. So, you know, everything I discovered sort of in this journey of setting up this national park, from the deep history, literally to the geology of the country, to the politics, to the wildlife. People don't realize that Afghanistan is this biological hotspot that brings together Europe, Africa, Asia together. There are hyenas in Afghanistan. There are brown bears and black bears. There are probably more cat species than sub-Saharan Africa at one point. There used to be, there are probably still cheetahs. There used to be tigers in Afghanistan, and we never see this, right? And so the second part was really, how do we present a picture of the country that is different than the images we see on the media? Because I don't think people see that when they are thinking about Afghanistan and looking about Afghanistan. They don't see the western end of the Himalayas. They don't see verdant oak and cedar forests. They don't see Sahel and savanna like grass pistachio woodlands in the west. And then third is just that there is, that this is really optimism, as we heard from our award winner earlier, that if you can literally build a national park in Afghanistan, then we've got the ability to solve these big global challenges together. And then lastly is just that things like science and conservation give us a common bond in which to unite people across different places, and that many of the things we're doing in conservation can actually work to help solve other problems in democracy, governance, even things like food security. So sort of that level, but just fundamentally, it was about, I just enjoyed telling the story.
Azar? Yeah. So, but just note, he talks about his subject, right? He has great passion about his subject, but he hasn't said much about himself and his own involvement in it. And so I'm going to come back to Alex because he's told some really interesting stories that you'll remember, I promise you, after I remind him the stories he told. Azar.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me. I was telling Alex that one of the best things about books is the connections they make. And they make you connect to people not because of your job or any ambition, but because of just the pure passion you have and the curiosity to know. So it is wonderful to be here, and I want to thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Before I was a writer, I was a reader. I mean, I cannot imagine, since I became conscious of myself, I cannot imagine having lived without books. When I was about 3.5 or 4 years old, every night my father would tell me a story before going to bed. And he was very democratic in the way he told his stories. One night he would be talking about our epic poet Ferdowsi. The next night we will fly to France with The Little Prince. The next night go to England with Alice in Wonderland, or come to the United States with Charlotte's Web and The Wizard of Oz. Before I came to America, I always thought that America is a place where at its heart there's a place called Kansas. And at the heart of Kansas, there was a tornado, a cyclone. And my idea of America was very whimsical, until, of course, I came to America. It's still whimsical, among other things. But anyway, to make this long story short, why I wrote Reading Lolita in Tehran, when I went back to Iran after the revolution, I found out that everything that I called home had changed. Yeah. That the first thing that a totalitarian system does, it confiscates your identity as a human being, as an individual. It confiscates your history. It takes away your reality. And the first thing they do is through laws. Like they changed the law of the age of marriage for women from 18 to 9. They brought the punishment of what they called stoning to death for what they called prostitution and adultery. And as soon as you attack reality, you attack imagination and ideas, which is books. So alongside of it, they executed writers and journalists and poets. They censored books. They prevented women from singing. And they took away dancing in public. And so everything that we did publicly went underground, and you couldn't talk about these things. So in my diary, I had opened a place titled Things I Have Been Silent About. And I had written about all the things that we did underground in Iran, like going to concerts in Iran, reading Jane Austen in Iran, and of course reading Lolita in Iran, having boyfriends in Iran, licking ice cream in public in Iran. So the list would go on and on. And to end it with, when I came to the United States, I had the feeling Alex talked about Afghanistan. I felt that the image of Iran was not only confiscated inside Iran, but outside as well. That bleak, black and white Iran that never existed at the worst days of this regime was now given to us as Iran. And it hurt me deeply to see this, you know. And I had learned that from my father and his stories that I can stay in a small room inside Tehran and the world will come to me. Now I wanted to go to the world. And I wanted to tell the world where I came from. And that is why I wrote Reading Lolita in Tehran about that other Iran, the confiscated Iran, but not the silenced one.
And Rick, why did you write your book, and why did you decide to include your personal self in that book?
Well, first off, thank you. It is an honor. I was a guest at a book gathering for Reading Lolita many years ago here in Washington, and it was just a huge pleasure. So I'm honored to be in this company. I was asked the same question a few months ago in Reading, Pennsylvania. I was meeting with a luncheon group like this, not quite this large, maybe 125 people, in what had been the poorest city in America for the last 3 decades. And it was a lively, vibrant gathering where you would not expect people to be talking about foreign affairs or peace building or the rest of it. And when I was asked the question, this bubble just came into my head just as I was asked, so I could come to places like Reading, Pennsylvania, and talk about what needs to happen in foreign places where we're not doing well and we're stuck. And people they hadn't really thought of themselves as having that important a role. But I realized if we're ever going to change this rather failed model, it's not just a failed narrative, that we had to engage the American public. We cannot be there on a tourist visa. And that's the way it works right now. We never have tax increases when we go into these wars. We don't have congressional votes. And we also don't have, only 1% of American families have people working in the military now. So we don't have the 3 ways we used to connect. And so I felt that great need to get our incredible work, the most compelling work on earth. The United States actually has the opportunity to make the world more peaceful. And we haven't done that well at it. So that really inspired me. And then I realized from my time as in communicating with people through politics and then in public service, that the best way to reach an American audience is to start with once upon a time. You almost always have the audience almost immediately if you can do that, whether it's a medical mystery or whether it's a war in a distant land. And I realized that while this should not be a memoir, it should be at least through the personal experiences, because that was not only more credible, but it was also much, much more compelling. And so that's really how I came to that.
So probably, had you not written in this personal way, you would not have been invited to Reading, correct? Because I don't know who you were talking to and what the group was in Reading, but in order to connect with those folks who live in Reading, it was your personal experiences, I'm sure, that were making more of a connection than the policy that you wanted to talk about as well.
I've tried the policy route. where somebody comes up to me and says, "What are you doing?" And after 20 seconds, I somehow have lost my audience. So I think, yeah, it's just, oh, that's very interesting. Thanks very much. And poof. So I do think you do have to, it does have to be personalized. And Americans are very personal. I mean, if you just remember your high school, if there was a single foreign student in our era, that would have been kind of a breakthrough. There was a fascination. People wanted to have that student over for dinner or tell me about your country. And so that curiosity is being vastly underestimated today, I think, in our public sphere. And this book has really allowed me to continue to expand that dialogue.
Sorry, you were, as you were writing the book, and maybe after the book was completed, you were in somewhat of a dangerous position, weren't you?
What position?
Danger.
Dangerous.
Were you?
Well,
I was worried about you as I read the book.
well, I would have been worried about me had I not written the book, because because you know, there are certain things that are like the blood running in your veins. What good would I be if I lost everything that I respected in myself? I think that is another thing about writing. You retrieve the self again, that stolen self in this case. Through telling your story, you gain control over the life that had been taken away from you. I wanted people to know the story through our eyes. And so that danger of losing myself took priority over any other danger coming from outside. You know.
Alex, I know you were in danger. The book starts with a dangerous moment. He's going to tell, I hope you're going to talk about that dangerous moment. You know which one I'm talking about? Okay. And it'd be awful if he didn't, right? So, and once he tells you this story, you may not read his book, and you may not talk to him anymore, but you will always remember this story.
Wow, what a setup.
So tell this story well, will you?
Yeah, it reads better than maybe I will tell it. So that's a plug for the book. But the basic thing is, you know, after 30 years of conflict in Afghanistan, you know, from the Soviet invasion, which was also the same year that we saw the revolution in Iran, and it was interesting that all of this was sort of happening to the region at the same time. We didn't know what happened to the wildlife. We didn't, you know, you've got this, and I just to describe some of it, you have a country that has snow leopards in it, that has these things called Marco Polo sheep, which I call Princess Leia sheep, because they're the biggest of the mountain sheep, and their horns are 6 feet long. You follow the curve of the horns, and they look like Princess Leia to me. But that's because I'm a nerd, as you pointed out. So, and I'll take that. But you also have like one of the world's biggest bird migrations pass through Afghanistan and hit this thing called the Wakhan corridor, which is this massive knot of mountains, and then they go sideways, literally, because they can't cross those mountains and then go back up from Africa all the way to the north of Russia. But there's these incredible wetlands. There are flamingos in Afghanistan. Actually, some of the flamingos at some of the highest altitudes, but there's a wetland right outside of Kabul that was actually biologically important. It's just been designated a protected area. We're now on the program I run set up in Afghanistan. I was the Afghanistan country director for the Wildlife Conservation Society, the Bronx Zoo. Still operates today, and they've set up 4 of these protected areas in the country with the help of a ton of other organizations and people. But one of the things we wanted to do is just say, what wildlife is left? Is there something there to really protect? And so we were doing bird surveys. On that particular day, normally we would do them in pairs. I would have someone pick me up, but like there weren't enough cars and there weren't enough people, so they just dropped me off at the wetland. And I'm sitting there with a spotting scope, just literally trying to count birds and figure out what's going on. And this guy comes up to me and just sort of, edges up right behind me, sort of, not unlike Trump next to Clinton, and does so in that slightly uncomfortable, awkward way, and then so I'll turn to him, very politely, knowing that I had no one around me, and he goes, "I'm a Talib. I'm a member of the Taliban," and I go, "Oh, that's nice." And there's really nothing else to do but to go back and counting birds. And he's still standing there, confused, I think, by that sort of nonchalant answer. And then I said, "Come over, and I'll show you how to count these birds." And I had the same issue in Madagascar, where we were working in some of the most remote parts of the country, and we would enter these areas, and it's an island, and you're intruding, and it's important to realize that. And I remember showing a local leader taking him on a night survey of lemurs around what we were doing. And by the next 2 days, everyone in that valley knew what we're doing. Really? So there's a real power to sharing, I think, in terms of the wonders of nature and the wonders of what we're doing. And that was the other thing, is we realized by protecting the wildlife, we're actually helping people who had been refugees for the last 30 years, 5.6 million who had gone to Iran and Pakistan and the Gulf and other countries, that this was a way to actually help protect your identity and restore it.
Yeah, the title of that chapter was "Bird Watching with the Taliban." Something, yeah. It was really quite cool, and there was one other cool thing that I just remembered, that what we have in this literary world, we call these magic moments, and this is what. And I worked for NPR for a while, and they used to call this hot type. Or hot tape, when something really happens that's going to stick. Maybe the book is 80,000 words, but there's going to be 650 words that's really going to stick in your mind. And that's hot tape, this moment for NPR, and magic moments in when we're writing. And that was one magic moment. And I'm sorry, one more, because I remember what's the burn rate?
So
you guys probably know what the burn rate is.
You guys probably know this, but obviously, if you look at the pressure that Congress put on USAID in our places, it was very hard to actually measure, how well we were doing. And the one thing that they did use to measure it was how fast you were spending money. So we would go to our co-tars at that time and say, look at how we've been actually saving money by all living together in a single guest house, not staying at the Serena Hotel, literally doing everything possible, and we got heavily criticized for that, and that was we even got criticized at one point for taking an Afghan and training him to be what is the best GIS remote sensing specialist in the country. And we got asked, why aren't you just hiring an expat to do that job? And I was like, I think we're unclear on what we are doing here around it. And I'm really proud to say that person is getting a PhD in the UK, that WCS, the Bronx Zoo, we stuck with the people we were training. These people are committed to Afghan conservation, and they're in at UMass Amherst and other places. And that's the future of the country, as we heard earlier today.
So Rick, do you have a magic moment or a hot tape moment that you want to share with us?
I don't know. I think that what Alex said about the immersion, that he was out there and he was so immersed in the subject, is really at the heart of it. In my case, it wasn't so much the wildlife of the area, but it's really the people of the area, because they're in the middle of a conflict or coming out of conflict, and it is the rawest possible human moment. There's a career moment that I think I wrote about in the book, where I had just gotten to Sarajevo in 1994, and I hadn't done this really before. I'd worked in Maine, and I'd been in politics and in business in Maine, but I also, in politics in particular, you spend a lot of time trying to get to know people and get to know the place, but mainly through the people, because they're the ones who vote. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to get to know Sarajevo, there was an expectation when I was sent there that there was a break in the fighting that had been the result of some NATO bombing right then. And so people thought that we might be returning to peace. And so I just started to go around the town, but I needed a translator, and I was very lucky to find an extremely literal, young local woman. And she was the sort of person, if you said, tell me, what's life like for young people here? We will go to the Rhythmic Gymnast Society. Who are these people who are dressed in sort of traditional Muslim garb? We will go to the Muslim Women's Organization. What's it like at the front line? We'll go to the front line. I mean, it was always, so I said, why would anybody want to have a baby here? We will go to the Kosovo hospital. So we went to the Kosovo hospital the next day, and of course all the doctors were already in Germany. All was left was one doctor who kind of led us around, and a bunch of nurses who didn't have the money to get out of town. So you immediately started to see what was happening. But I said, I'm really interested. They showed me how they treated the wounded and whatnot, but then I said, I really would like to talk to somebody maybe who's having a baby. Oh, I know just the place. And this being kind of a socialist era doctor, he opened the door in the delivery room, and there was a woman in the middle of delivery. Now, my wife, I just got through that about 6 years before, and I realized my wife was not very welcoming of that kind of attention at that time. But I also thought this could be a career moment. I may never, and I said to him, is there anybody else who's about to have a baby but is not in actual delivery? And he said, no, you can talk to her. I said, I'd really rather not. And fortunately, he'd led me to a room where there were 6 women waiting, and it was a typical Yugoslav scene. It was on the ground floor, there were the windows, the husbands were outside smoking like crazy, and the women were sort of waiting in beds, and I had my yellow legal pad, and I started asking them, why is it that you would want to have a child in this time? And of course, it's those conversations where you really start to get the feeling of what's going on in the place. And it wasn't that they had any big hope that the war had ended. They just said, if we're ever going to get on with our lives, we have to do this now. That's how profound it got. And it did help to come back to Washington and say, this is actually a temporary break. This is not a peaceful moment. There's a 10% chance that peace will hold, and we better be bracing for this next round of fighting, and that's very much what happened. But if it hadn't been for that immersion and for that, just meeting people where they are comfortable, and again, giving the authority to them rather than to me with my ideas and my solutions and the way that I think they should live their lives, it's a much, much better way to go. And I think that's been a constant in all the remarks before us and on this panel.
This is such an appreciative, respectful audience. Usually when I talk to my colleagues, writers, they like to drink, but they don't laugh, and they certainly don't applaud. So thanks a lot. It's really quite nice. One thing I noted about all of your books was how careful and detailed you focused on the characters you introduced, the people who were part of your story. Especially your book, all those people in that same room together. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the people you wrote about, and also, and I'll ask both you the same questions, but also how they felt about the way in which you characterized them?
About the way I characterized the girls?
The people that you wrote about, yes.
That I wrote about. Well, first of all, I wanted to tell you an anecdote
Please.
About why it was that writing and reading in Iran for us was not just a pastime. It was almost a matter of life and death, and I'll talk about that in the context of the characters. The anecdote I wanted to talk about was one by the Swedish playwright Strindberg, August Strindberg. They say that one night he was in a bar, and this guy comes to him and challenges him, so they walk out and start fighting. And in the middle of the fight, Strindberg stops and tells the guy, "I'll see you in my book, you bastard," and walks back into the bar. And that is, that was how books were for us. I mean, I wrote, especially reading Lolita, but even Republic of Imagination, I wrote them because I would see these bastards in my books, and I would see both the good and the bad. But as for the characters, reading for us became a way of connecting to one another. And I remember especially one student who gets me emotional every time I talk about her. She was very tiny, and she was an Orthodox Muslim, always wore a black chador and hid, and came from a very poor family. Her father was dead. Her mother was a washerwoman. And she fell in love with Henry James and with the novels of Henry James, and especially Daisy Miller and Catherine Sloper in Washington Square. She admired these women who, as Daisy Miller says, don't be afraid, I'm not afraid. And I'll come back to Razieh. And then there was another girl who was also, you see, what I discovered was that with those students of mine whom I could not speak openly or politically, I could speak to them through the stories. And I always connected to them through the stories. And there was another girl who was in the Muslim Student Association, and at the beginning of the term, she came to me complaining about Wuthering Heights, telling me that, why are you teaching, these are all a bunch of adulterers, in this book, and how could you teach a book like this? Honest to God, I'm not making it up. At the end of the term, she came to me and she said, all my friends at the dorm are making fun of me because I've fallen in love with Catherine and Heathcliff. And can you recommend another book like this by them? And that was how it was. You see, where politics fails, culture comes in. The strongest thing US has is not its military might. It is the culture. That is what people are curious about. And going back and finishing the story on that girl who loved James, there was a cultural revolution, as in China, in Iran, and they closed down all the universities, and a lot of people went underground, including my student who loved Henry James. And a few years, I had lost track of her, and a few years later, one other student came to me, and she was actually a Marxist, and they were both in the same cell. They were both arrested by the regime, and they were in the same cell together. And this girl told me, Razieh, that was the name of the girl who was my student. She said she and I would talk a great deal about Scott Fitzgerald and Henry James. And she said that those days in jail, that is how we resurrected ourselves. We came back to life again. And she told me that Razieh was executed. So, and I felt how ironic. I can use her real name in my book because she's gone, Yes. And I want to ask you, this question has always been with me. Henry James could not save Razieh's life. She would be dead. And you hear yet so many stories like hers, where like Primo Levi, the Italian writer, talks about how when he was in the concentration camp, his most important mission was to translate and talk about Dante to his French cellmates. Now, Dante would do nothing for Primo Levi. Why is it that when you're at death's door, you think of James and Fitzgerald and Dante, And the only thing I came up with was that human dignity is very important to us as human beings. And when you are at death's door, when you lose your faith in humanity itself, you instinctively go back to the achievements of humanity, to those achievements that celebrate the dignity and the integrity of the individual. And that is why you go to fiction, because that is where it is celebrated, you know. And so that is how I remember each of my students.
And Rick, do you want to maybe say something about the people you've captured in your book? And more often, and also, because this is a scary thing for writers to do, it's not as if we're getting permission to write these things about the people about whom we're writing. I'm sure that in all your cases, everybody didn't know you were capturing them. When you're writing a book, you don't even know half the time what you're going to do the next day anyway. We don't have much time left, I don't think, but I'd be really curious to see what the results were, what people that you captured in words, what they said, were they surprised, were they offended? There's this phrase that we use in the work I do, innocent victims. That is to say, people we write about that they don't even know they're being written about, and then one day they open up a book, or a cousin opens up a book, and suddenly they're recognized.
Yeah, it preoccupied me a great deal.
Did it?
Writing
Yeah.
about them, and I tried to sort of change. I wanted them their identity to be completely protected in one sense. And one of the interesting things about this class was that they came from such different backgrounds. They came from people who were practicing Muslims to people who were atheists to the ones who were Sufis. And what they had in common was this class. So we got very close. While I was writing the book, I tried to talk to as many of them as I could, especially one whom I call Mana in my book, and she now lives with her husband in Washington, D.C., in fact. I remember she and I going around. I brought her here for a conference, and we were going around trying to find pseudonyms for them, for each of them. Some of them I lost contact with, so I don't know how they felt. I was lucky in that I didn't hear complaints, but I'm sure there were some. No one is happy with the portrait someone else creates of them. So I'm positive that there were complaints.
I think the point that you made about the human dignity and how people cannot take that away from you, but if you start with respecting that, and in my own case, I have not had a lot of people yet who are mentioned in the book, because the stories are in these different countries, and I'm not sure that my book has had the circulation that some of your books have had. But there is a story near the end that I'm very curious as to what has happened. And it's a story really about human resilience and about America's incredible advantage in the world, that people would even want someone to come and reaffirm their own sense of dignity. And the United States actually gets that option sometimes, which is pretty shocking. But in this case, I was working at the United Nations, and we were at a refugee camp, and I'd spent the whole day at refugee camps, and being a high official from in Guinea, right at the Parrot's Beak, where Liberia and Sierra Leone and Guinea meet. And there was an area at that time that had 350,000 refugees, and I was the Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees. So an important person was coming to town, let's dress it up, and maybe something good will happen, was the general theme of the day. But near the end of the day, after people had been kind of putting on the show, my Sudanese assistant said, "I'd like to take you to the clinic. There's somebody there who wants to meet you." And there was a very, very young mother who had just had triplets that day. And I don't think any of them were bigger than maybe this pitcher of water here. And, but she said through a translator, she had two little girls and a boy. She said, "I've named my son Barton." Now, it had nothing to do with me, obviously. I mean, she didn't know me, but she was just grabbing for whatever she could. Yeah. And that was a very real opportunity to maybe give her tiny, tiny son a slightly better chance at life. And it was pretty powerful. And of course, I've wondered where little Barton might be and whether he survived that day or even that week. So anyway, those are the kinds of things that happen to you. And if you're open to them and you love the work, which most of you in this room should love your work. We get paid to do Mother Teresa's work, and it's pretty powerful.
I'm told that we have to end this conversation now, but I love the way we've talked about loving our work here. In the end, these folks are not only committed to certain things that they want to do in life to make the world better, but they also committed themselves to a book and perhaps more books as time passes, and that's part of the writing life. It's a wonderful thing to do, to take the life you have and try to capture that life in many words and capture the people that you have been able to connect with, the people who have resonated in your life, especially when you are doing such incredibly important work for the world, and be able to recreate that cinematically, three-dimensionally, and share it with either 5,000 people or perhaps 1 million people, but be able to share it. It's something I'm so glad that Anne entered into my class and shared her life with the rest of my students and me. And I'm encouraging you all, because you do this work, and in so many ways, the work you do is so isolated, so disconnected from the folks I know in Reading and in Pittsburgh, and so think about sharing your world with the larger world, and you'll end up loving your work in two different ways, both the work you do now and the work that you do secretly at night with your keyboard. So thank you so much for listening with us.